Welcome to the first plenary session of this conference, which is on international experiences of urbanization and learnings from Global South for Global South. The chairperson of this session is Professor Ashwani Seth, Professor Emeritus, International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, the Netherlands. Thank you for agreeing to chair this session and welcome on the dais, sir. The speakers in this session are Megha Mukim, who is Senior Economist, World Bank from Washington, D.C., Weiping Wu, a Professor of Urban Planning and Director, Urban Planning Programs at Columbia University, USA, Ahmed Gamal, Director of Innovation and Science Technopark and Faculty Department of Architecture, University of Indonesia, and Partha Mukhopadhyay, he's Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. I request Professor Seth to please conduct the session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to chair the session. I'm not a specialist in urban planning. I come from the other end of the spectrum where often in conversations, loose conversations, we always complain about the lack of accountability amongst lawyers, doctors, and urban planners, the way the cities are going. But I think Ruth reminded me, responded in the morning, that urban planners of these three urban planners can blame the politicians. Anyway, I think there's a lot on the table. It's a huge, massive conference, most impressive. And there are a lot of learnings there which we're going to look forward to. I don't want to take any time, but we have four very eminent and learned speakers today. And the structure will be that we'll follow the same listing as we have in the program. 20 minutes for each speaker. They have been informed, and I told there's Sandeep somewhere lurking with some placards, -5, -2. That's very nice because it allows me to be friendly with the people. But I've warned them that once those 2 minutes are over, I'll start kicking them under the table. But the idea is that we, hopefully, in the question answer, we will be able to really enrich the ideas which come up from the table. And then I'm trying to make sure that we have some time where we can throw the ball back to the panelists here for, say, a few minutes each, where they sum up their own thoughts on this, how the session has gone. We had a very impressive opening talk from the chief guest, and I think, I'll come to that maybe when Megha speaks. So let me just say that we have here, I'm going to, in the first order, Megha Mukim, Senior Economist at the World Bank. She's going to speak on thriving, making cities green, resilient, inclusive in a changing climate. If she can do that in 20 minutes, I'll be following you. Weiping Wu, Professor of Urban Planning, Director of Urban Planning Programs at Columbia University, and she's also, as of a few days ago, starting from a few days down the line, the Vice Provost is the term you use. Proctor, I went back to my LSE. Vice Provost for all academic programs at Columbia. So that's pretty big. So and her work is on the cities and especially for China is enormous. I mean, it's quite a body of work. And we are very happy to welcome Ahmed Gamal. Why urbanization? First of all, I think Weiping Wu, Professor Wu is going to speak on China's urbanization in the global context, impacts and transitions. And I think that session that talk is going to be especially interesting because China has a way of doing things which is slightly stands apart from many others in the global south. And I think there are lots of learnings, hopefully positive, to listen to there. And then Gamal is going to speak on why urbanization and industrialization do not always translate into rural welfare, the Indonesian example. And finally, we have a presentation from Partha Mukhopadhyay, a Senior Fellow of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And this is on the Indian urban transformation. It's a sui generis, subaltern, and sustainable. So there are some mystifying words there, and they are sort of the spice to whet your appetite. So in great anticipation, we'll see what sui generis and that one can understand. But where subaltern goes, we have to see. how subversive it becomes, how interesting it is. But so there's a great panel and a range of things. And so without ado, let me start. Megha, Mukim, you have the floor, 20 minutes. People can talk from here or they can go up. That's their choice.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real privilege. I'm going to spend my 20 minutes and discuss with you the World Bank's flagship report called Thriving: How to Make Cities Greener, More Resilient, and More Inclusive in a Changing Climate. The report was launched at COP27 in November, and it was launched again by our senior management. Those are our senior managing directors and our vice president. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because the World Bank is fully committed to helping our clients in cities adapt to a changing climate, and this is essentially what the report is going to talk about. So the report has two key objectives. The first objective is to provide rigorous empirical evidence on how climate change is impacting cities, and the reverse, how it is that urban development in cities is actually impacting the environment. And then the second main objective is to provide a policy compass for our clients in cities and at the national level to thrive in a world that is going to be confronted by a changing climate. To achieve its first objective, the report poses an overarching question which is in front of you. How green, how resilient, and how inclusive are cities today? And to answer this question, we looked at a database of 10,000 cities globally. We contracted a global typology of cities, so we looked at cities that were small, medium, and large in lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. This is the classification that the World Bank has by income groups for our clients. And from this analysis, what I'll do today is I'm going to highlight some of our key findings that I think would be relevant for this audience going forward. So our first key finding is that it is cities in high and higher middle income countries that are responsible for the vast bulk of urban CO2 emissions. So 86% of total urban CO2 emissions comes from cities in high income and higher middle income countries, which basically means that the reverse of which, cities in low and lower middle income countries are responsible only for 14% of the global urban emissions. And in fact, if you break that down even further, you find that cities in the poorest countries, which are cities in low-income countries, are actually responsible for 0.2% of the total CO2 urban global emissions. Now, this is not to say that these cities in lower middle-income and low-income countries shouldn't be worrying about the rising emissions. Why? We find that if cities in upper middle income countries and in high income countries were to meet all of their net zero emissions target, and cities in lower middle income countries and low income countries did absolutely nothing, by the time we reached 2040, we would still be about 4.2 times higher than where we want to be for our 1.5 degree Celsius. And so essentially what we're saying is, although what has actually happened in the past has been with cities in higher income countries that have contributed, that does not mean that cities in low income countries can do nothing about the problem going forward. While it is cities in high income countries that have contributed to the most global emissions, it is actually cities in the low income countries that are going to be most affected by it. So we constructed a composite climate change affected hazard index, and we looked at 6 hazards. We looked at floods, droughts, sea level rises, let me look at my notes, water stress, cyclones, wildfires. And we essentially found that the projected exposure between now and 2040 is going to be far higher for the cities that are in poorer countries. An important finding linked to this is that these climate change hazards are not uniformly distributed across cities, in countries, and across and within countries. So, if you see on this figure, which is basically showing urban heat stress across different cities across the globe, this is looking at the frequency of extreme heat stress. And when I say frequency of extreme heat stress, it means the number of months for a given city where the heat stress is higher what it would have been historically speaking from the city's own past over the period of 2011 to 2020. And we find that this frequency is different. So of course, cities in India have much higher projected frequency of heat stress compared to, say, cities in Eastern Europe, which is where I work currently for my position. But even if you look within India, you find that cities in the south of India have much higher frequency of heat stress as compared to cities in the north of India. Now, it's not just the frequency of the heat stress that we're talking about. We also care about the intensity of the heat stress. It's not just the number of months that you have higher than expected heat, but it's also the intensity during those months that you have higher than expected heat. And there the picture is a bit different. So again, I'll come back to India as an example. Now it is cities in the north of India that have much higher intensity of heat stress as compared to cities in the south of India. Now, these differences matter. In economic jargon, this spatial heterogeneity matters in the data, because if you're thinking about adaptation, it's far easier to adapt if you have a city that has higher frequency but low intensity of extreme weather events, as opposed to if you're in a city that has lower frequency but higher intensity of extreme weather events going forward. A fourth key finding that we have. Cities in low-income countries are not just exposed much more to the direct impacts of climate change, they are also exposed a lot more increasingly to the indirect impacts of climate change. And what do I mean by that? That means when you have climate change shocks that actually take place outside of cities, it is actually cities that are being increasingly affected themselves. We did a paper which essentially looks at droughts outside of cities, across all cities and countries in the world. And we found that when you have increased droughts, you find a lot more push migration of people coming into cities. And we find using satellite imagery, you can see that there's an increase in the urban built-up form in these cities. And what's more interesting is that in certain parts of the world, that urban built-up form could actually be informal. So, for instance, we find in Niamey, I'll take Niamey in Niger because it's been in the news a lot recently. In Niamey in Niger, we found, and that little figure that you see is actually Niamey, the capital of Niger. The purple spots on that map is showing you what part of the city has grown since 1985, and almost all of it is essentially informal. This is not something that is only for Niamey. You'll find that in a lot of the low-income cities, it's mainly growth that's coming from push migration, as the G20 Sherpa mentioned, is essentially settling in slums or in rural, informal areas, I beg your pardon, in these cities. And so the lack of resilience is also resulting in a lack of inclusion. And a lack of inclusion, on the other side, also leads to a lack of resilience. When I say lack of inclusion, we're not just talking about poverty and inequality, but we're talking about lack of access to markets, lack of access to basic services, and so on. The final finding that I would like to share with you, and also one that we found quite surprising. When we started this work, the state of Florida in the United States was very much in the news because there was news of urban development that was taking place in Florida, in spite of the fact that it was known that it was going to be prone to natural disasters in the future. We thought this was going to be a US phenomenon, quite frankly, when my co-author and I, Mark Roberts, we started the research. Turns out, not really. We did a paper and we find this is a global phenomenon. We find that over time, construction has been growing dramatically in what we call future bad locations. These are cities that are going to become increasingly unlivable and much more prone to natural hazards in the future, and construction in these places is accelerating over time. You can see by the lines that there are major conferences on climate change that announce or the impacts of climate change, and you can see there's absolutely no relationship between these global conferences and what it is that markets, developers, households and firms are responding to in the market. We also find that not only is the phenomenon accelerating, but in fact the kinds of buildings that we're talking about, these are tall buildings. Tall buildings means they are durable buildings, these are long-lasting buildings over time, and they're increasing construction in places that are going to become more and more unlivable in the future. This is puzzling and extremely worrying. So, I've covered in hopefully my first 10 minutes what we know from the research. In the next 10 minutes, I'll cover what it is that we do with the work that we've done. What is it that policymakers, especially policymakers in low-income countries, can do about this? Our conclusions are organized around three questions. What can be done? Who does it? And how can it be done? So, on the first question, what are the choices? policymakers can draw on 5 broad sets of policy instruments, or what we call the 5 I's, and I'll run you through all of the 5 I's quickly with a few examples. The first I is information. Information helps firms and households make better decisions. You can think about information as big chunks of information, like early warning systems. You can also think about information which is much more finely grained, like building codes or zoning regulations in cities, for instance. The second I is incentives. Incentives are needed to motivate the right decisions. Incentives can have extremely high co-benefits, even at very low costs. An example that we take often is of the removal of the fuel subsidy in Egypt, which had a high impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions, of reducing pollution, at the same time actually increasing the fiscal sustainability of the Egyptian budgets. The third I is insurance. Insurance can minimize the financial impact of the disasters through risk sharing, and also by providing much needed post-disaster risk financing efficiently, quickly and efficiently in the future. The fourth I is integration. Integration refers to both compactness within the city. Again, this was referred to in the morning repeatedly. Compactness makes cities much more efficient, but also leads to cities being greener, contributing less to GHG emissions. But you can also think of compactness in terms of connectivity between cities, or connectivity between urban areas and their rural hinterlands and markets. And then the last I is investments. Investments that can be used to prevent, to anticipate, and to respond to the impacts of disasters. You can think about flood control systems, environmental buffers, roads that guide urban development away from high hazard prone areas, mitigation investments such as building retrofits for energy efficiency and so on. The report is peppered with examples, and I actually got a few copies of the summary report, and unfortunately very few because I didn't realize there would be so many people in the room. Apologies. So let me stop here for a moment, take a breather, and ask you a question. How many in the audience have children, if you don't mind me asking a personal question? All right, so I have 2 children. And when I had my first child, I took CPR training. And I was taught, which I didn't know, is that CPR training for children, which is given like this, is actually very different from CPR training that's given to adults, which is like this. And this is because children are not small adults. In the same way, cities are not small countries. Cities have a limited policy space that they need to utilize to get things done. Nonetheless, they can be opportunistic. We believe that our clients, mayors, can actually do a lot. We talk about something called the mayor's wedge in the report, which talks about what mayors actually have control over and how they can effectively crowd in actions from other actors, non-state, including non-state actors like communities, NGOs, and so on. How to get it done. Some of the actions are going to be common to all cities. For instance, how to green. Even if emissions is a secondary concern for cities, if you were to take a business as usual approach to growth in the future, there would be very high costs with retrofitting that would be associated with that. How to increase resilience. We already talked about the fact that a lot of cities in low-income countries are going to be increasingly affected by the effects of climate change. However, no city is not going to be affected. There are going to be direct impacts and indirect impacts that are going to increase, which means resilience is going to be important for all cities. And then how to further inclusion. Much of the risks are going to fall on poorer places and on more vulnerable populations. However, that is not to say that poor places and poor people are not found in rich countries. The CEO of Sydney said in a podcast, and I quote, "No one goes out on election day and says, oh, gee, the emissions are down today." The residents of cities may not really care about greening or think of climate change as a very secondary concern, especially when it is pitted against poverty, inequality, lack of basic services, lack of public transport, and so on. And developing countries are especially at a disadvantage. Why? Because we're already in a warmer climate and we have a lot more rainfall variability to start with. And of course, developing countries have lower incomes and in many cases lower capabilities to deal with the problem as well. I'm almost done. In the report, we also discuss how the different types of cities, which confront different types of challenges, can combine, can prioritize, and can sequence the different bundles of interventions that I mentioned, the 5 I's. How do policymakers choose and bundle between these interventions? How can they do that in a way that's going to produce the greatest positive impact for the most people at the lowest possible cost and the most efficient manner? This is something, again, that we discuss in the report, and we provide a couple of examples of the different choices and the different trade-offs that different types of policymakers that are confronted by different climate change shocks have to deal with. The good news is that cities can arrive at greener, more resilient, and more inclusive outcomes in many ways. A favorite example of mine is that in many cities and countries I've worked in, I find that people have to make, poor people especially, when they're deciding where to live in a city, have to make very unpalatable choices. They have to think about where they can access jobs and access services, and whether it's a safe neighborhood. If you think about urban planners contributing to cities, you can actually ease that trade-off for the poor people in your city. You can make access to jobs and access to services while mitigating the impacts of the climate change shocks that they deal with. This report provides several recommendations, but mainly it provides a policy compass for cities moving forward. So, 2 things to end with today. One is that the database that I mentioned of the 10,000 cities and the accompanying code is going to be made available as part of a thriving database dashboard that we're putting together. Hopefully it'll be available in a couple of weeks, and we'd be very pleased to share it and have your feedback on that. This is for academics, researchers, common people. We're trying to make sure that the database is as useful and as accessible as possible. And the second thing to mention is I myself am an Indian citizen. I don't work on the South Asia region. I work in a different region, but I'm pleased to say that our team in the South Asia region, the World Bank's team in South Asia, is actually working on a compendium of the Thriving report called India Thriving. And they're currently working on this report, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to put you in touch with some of our team members who are based in Delhi and DC so that you can add your inputs going forward on the work that we're doing there. So let me stop here. Here's the report for downloading. I have a couple of the copy of the summaries. And thank you again for this opportunity to speak here. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
That was a pretty good start, I would say. As chairman, I'm focusing on the time, but I think it left nothing out in terms of the density of ideas which was presented. I think we have a pretty good idea there of what the World Bank is thinking about in this regard globally and the South. So I think thank you, Megha, for that very neat and compact, to use a term of the day, presentation. So we move now to Professor Wei-Ping Wu, who's going to talk about China's urbanization in the global context, impacts and transitions.
Thank the Institute for Human Development and University of Florida for making my dream coming true to finally come to India, the land of spectacular history and regional diversity. I've only traveled a few days, but it's incredible, and I think it's really also lending this perfect platform after Megha's presentation on cities, but also thinking about how China and India in many ways share historical legacies, the demographic complexity, and the rapid urge to urbanize. So if I may, in the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to share with you my work. It's been many years working on China. I'm originally from China, but also more recently collaborating with scholars from different disciplines on the issue of urbanization in China, very much the spirit of this conference. And so really, I think for those of us who are in the Global South, although in the first session, I heard a little bit of that sentiment that China is not part of the Global South. But anyway, we can discuss that, right? So I think there's a lot of sentiment that China is unique, and to whom shall we compare China, and to what shall we compare, and how shall we compare? And I think the point is not that critical in that sense of comparison, but really is, I think, in terms of us as urban scholars, we could be from different disciplines, urban and planning scholars, I think centering Global South in the urban conversation is actually more of a critical question. So really, I like to kind of in a large way call for everyone to be thinking about provincializing urban research, because much of the urban and planning theories have originated in regions of a particular context. And those theories are subsequently considered to be universal. And so in my work, and also borrowing from other China scholars, and I do believe move China from being provincialized to charting an alternative pathway is very much critical. But how do we do so really should be grounded empirically, and should be grounded not so much on a premise of China exceptionalism or the American exceptionalism. Really, we share a lot of urban challenges, and we share many potential responses to these challenges. So position that. So in this presentation, you will see I'm not comparing China and India, or I'm not comparing China and the US. I'm drawing quite, widely from various different experiences. So this, in a graphic sense, I really would love to see all of us contributing to provincializing urban and planning knowledge and theory, and to put Global South more in the center of that debate. So previously, in decades that I've worked on Chinese cities and urbanization, migration, and infrastructure financing, I want to give you, so based on that result, I want to first situate you a little bit since 1979, how urbanization has progressed in China. And that book, The Chinese City, has a lot of details. So here I just want to give you a quick capture. That is, Chinese urbanization did not happen and did not start in a vacuum. It very much was a product of the economic reform and transition that the Chinese, the nation, the country, has been through. So it is very much an urbanization with growth. Oftentimes we do think about certain parts of the world experiencing urbanization without growth. However, that growth has been challenged not just by COVID, but also other structural factors at work. And urbanization also has been taking place in China with societal transition. Obviously, you could say, well, so urbanization is a process of a migration, but that migration was actually created by the kind of change in institutions, in the setup of market institutions, as Professor says, was talking about this rural to urban transition, was a very large driving force of migration. And then the transition from planned to market economy was at play as well. The transition from autarky to open regime in terms of investment and trade was yet another major societal force. In the end, we all think about China as a very centralized country, politically very much so, but physically, it is actually one of the most decentralized countries in Global South, shall we consider that way. So there's a whole very high degree of autonomy by local governments, cities, towns, counties, and so on. So if we look at these large societal forces and transitions at the national level, then we can understand better why urbanization has proceeded in China with such rapid pace as well as significant scope, and not to forget the role of the state. So that started 25 years ago. I'm sorry, not 25 years ago. I should do my math, 45 years ago. In that 45 years, lots have changed. So this recent work, which reflects the title of my talk, is that we've been seeing real dilemmas in China's urbanization. We've been seeing real transitions. We've been seeing the impact of urbanization on every single facet of human conditions and lives, and the natural and the built environments. So this book was my effort to bring scholars from different disciplines to really look at the impact and the transitions, the changes. So we asked a number of questions, how has urbanization shaped, as well as being shaped by social, economic, and physical interactions that take place in and beyond cities. What are the shifts and transitions emerging in urban China, and what are some new sources of information for conducting research on urban China? The last question was actually almost accidental. Just before pandemic, we started the project, and now with the kind of different geopolitical situation, made it all actually more urgent as scholars to consider. But in today, I really just want to look at two types of impact of urbanization in terms of on the urban form and land, as we talked about in the talk in the opening session, but also on human condition, and then briefly talk about the kind of transitions that are happening within the urbanization process. So in the first session, we heard a little bit of China's urbanization perhaps is maturing. That's quite much true. But there's still room to grow. So worldwide, if we look at urbanization levels, very much most countries, except the very small countries, approach about 80% urbanization rate, and that tapers off, right? So US, as you can see, European countries, again, with the exception of very small countries where you might have a city-state or similar to city-state. So China now is a little over 60% urbanized, and then you see the rapid takeoff in the last 30 to 40 years. And then if you look at geographical distribution of cities, is actually quite unique. China, in territorial-wise, is very similar to the United States in terms of size, in terms of dimensions, but in terms of resource distribution and in terms of concentration of population is entirely different. And so 95% of the population actually lives to the east of the country and another 5% to the west of the country. However, 40% of the territory is to that side and 60% to the other side. And the resource-wise, it coincides with the territory, not with the population. So actually, there's huge challenge of transportation, huge challenge of population concentration, challenge of arable land. So not unlike India, it's hugely complex geography. So in the last 30 to 40 years, that huge challenge in a complex geography has shown up in urban areas in a very peculiar way. So we all know about 200 to 300 million of migrants in the last 30 or so years have moved from rural areas to cities in China. Yes, so there should be lots of population growth in urban areas, right? Yes, we do see that. So on top, the top line, so you have to look at the axis on the left, so percentage urban, really steadily growing. That actually includes migrants since 2000. But wait a minute. If we look at the right side of the y-axis, it seems like the land area of cities have actually increased quickly or more quickly. Now, to me, that's counterintuitive. As I have shown you the geography early, we have more population on the east side, but less land. So if we we observe the talk of compact cities or urban form, this is totally counterintuitive, right? So wait until the mystery of the story to be told. So a little more evidence of that. So this is the city of Nanjing, and just southern part, a coastal city, 11 million population, fairly large provincial capital. You can see the footprint of the city increasing in 20 years. right? So yet another set of evidence that this is actually done by World Bank, showing that between 2000 and 2010, the number of cities in China that have witnessed higher land growth versus population growth. So the pattern is very different in the rest of East Asia and Pacific region, in which most of the cities witnessed more population growth rather than more land growth. And then, yes, if you see this, obviously this comparison is not my own work. I'm borrowing other people's work. As you can see, of course, this comparison is problematic because countries have developed and urbanized at different point of time historically. So we really should be comparing cities at the similar stage of development. But nonetheless, you can see whatever you see as red is what we call the urban sprawl. And then Chinese cities really have seen a lot more of that in the decade from 2000 to 2010. So compared to North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China all together, the rate of urban land growth is actually the fastest in Chinese cities. Well, obviously, US and Europe are not so comparable, but Sub-Saharan Africa and India are. So at the core of this, so back to my fundamental question of the impact of urbanization as well as how other institutional forces shape urbanization, I think land is at the core of this question, especially in China. So this is complex and I won't take the time. But really, if you think about the ways in which land property rights operate, China is similar only to a handful of cities in which land is on leasehold in urban areas. In rural areas, it is different. And then Netherlands, Singapore, Hong Kong, Sweden are the comrades in that group. And United States is sort of the opposite. That is freehold. It's very much, I think India is similar to that. And this question of property regime, to me, is at the core of the urban sprawl. So local governments, as I mentioned earlier, are highly or have a high level of autonomy. And one significant intervention local states have been involved in has been funding infrastructure. Of course, both physical and human. But how do they get the resources to do that? The Chinese tax system reform in 1994 actually made it a lot harder for local governments to have tax incomes to do that. So the ingenuity is to turn public land into a money-making entity. And that is not directly through local governments, but through these what we call local government finance vehicles to take rural land through either developers or cities themselves and turn rural lands into urban by designation and then lease out to private developers and recuperate with large volume of revenue. Those revenue are then serve as collaterals, particularly future land lease revenues as collaterals to get more loans from banks or through project bonds to the public. All of that resource, capital, go into infrastructure projects and then stimulate local economies and so on and so forth, right? So that, okay. And so it's good, right? You think it's really good. But it also creates the perverse incentive for local governments to develop more and more and more for that revenue. Because there is no property tax in Chinese cities. So there is no annual revenue income to fund local projects. They rely on this. So the lease terms are either 30 years, 50 years, and 70 years. So down the road, they're going to run out of those kinds of revenue. Anyway, so the result of that perverse incentive has created quite a bit sort of sprawl forms of cities and urban forms in terms of both street network density. As you can see, of course, the comparison is not completely pertinent, but you can see Chinese cities are a lot hard to walk around because streets have bigger blocks and streets are wider. Not unlike here, right? So you can see the comparisons, just a little more evidence. So quickly to walk it through, I apologize, I don't think you can see that well. So let me also just to give you the kind of impact on humans, that human conditions. So in the last 30 to 40 years, abject poverty has significantly declined in terms of absolute poverty, if you count whatever poverty lines, but relative poverty has increased. And the percentage of migrants in cities also have increased hugely, right? So over time. The reason I show that is also because migrants did not fare very well, but in the last 20 to 30 years, migrants have been doing better in terms of wage rates. I really apologize. You can check out the book. And urbanization not only has impact on those who came or who have come to cities, but also on those who have stayed behind. So in Chinese rural countrysides, not only we see the emptiness of villages and the feminization of agriculture, and more we're seeing increasingly the elderly population being affected. So this one chapter in the book talks about how the elderly is affected in terms of lack of social care, as well as in terms of mental health and medical health, and then what we call the disappearing elderly. So the last couple of minutes, I just want to bring you to two key transitions that the Chinese cities are witnessing. First is this concept of developmental delay. And that is not mine, and that's by Professor Justin Remis from UC Berkeley, in which he argues that the Chinese in China, but also elsewhere, the progress that's made in the last 30 to 40 years will be literally and figuratively in the way by climate change and its impact. Basically, it's going to take longer to achieve the kind of human development end goals that was aimed for. And the delay will affect different populations differently and in terms of different kinds of environmental impact as well. So the last bit of transition is to look at environmental transition in which some Chinese cities are more like cities in the global north with large ecological footprint and large environmental impact. And so you can see a number of different cities having very different kinds of pollution levels in terms of different types of pollution. So this is just evidence to show that. So in our work, essentially, we are really trying to see that urbanization is a complex and regionally diverse process, and it affects population and different populations in different ways, and some more positive and some less so. And so I would say that to place China in this kind of global context and in this very empirically grounded manner, and then we're able to understand cities in China better, we also are able to hopefully to understand cities in general better. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wu. That was very enlightening. On China, lots of angles to think about. I think that you have conventional ideas about China, and I think you need to take a magnifying glass to those and also turn them upside down and see how well they work. So we'll come back into this, I think, in the discussion for sure. So I turn now to Ahmed Gamal. Gamal is going to speak on why urbanization and industrialization, and he says, does not always translate into rural welfare. So we must assume that urbanization and industrialization.
So good morning. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Shub Prabhat. So a little bit on what I'm trying to attempt to do this morning. This morning, we had a conversation about structural change. In the global south, we want to have cities, we want to have some kind of a structural change. We want to have a transformation of people who live in villages into people living in cities. But also, I think there is at least a gap in the current planning literature, right, that discusses the relationship between urbanization and livelihood impacts. I would like to discuss three things. One is I would like to discuss the impact of losing land and the impact of urbanization on household livelihood. I would also like to talk about the correlation between the geography of urbanization and poverty incidence, and to address the logical fallacy in our planning processes, because sometimes development involves state-sponsored displacement. Some of the partial findings that I would present today is that we can find quantifiable adverse impacts to households who are locked in agriculture while the place they live in is urbanizing. And it's actually the fashion rather than the rapidness of urbanization that would help us predict where poverty would incide. So to begin with, this is kind of the industrialized cities that we always expect. We want our cities to be somewhat formally developed. We want to look at some forms of regularity in zoning, in urban patterns, in buildings, no sprawls, and so on and so forth. And we aspire to have agglomeration of industrial facilities, commercial facilities, and we expect our cities to provide for numerous high-paying jobs. But instead, the reality check is often like this. Sometimes this is the poor peri-urban regions that we get. We see pockets of informal settlements. We see irregular urban patterns. We see unregulated mixed-useness. Sometimes when we say mixed-used, it's a good term in planning, but the reality that we get in the global south is that the unregulated mixed-useness is not something that is beautiful to see. And we see some form of hybrid urban-rural kind of lifestyle. We see places where there are high-paying industrial jobs, but also places with low-paying agricultural jobs. And what is really puzzling, and hopefully I can highlight today, is that sometimes our cities have a chronic and persistent urban poverty. So really, the current literature focuses heavily on the urbanization of the population and less on the urbanization of places. What that means is that we know a little bit more about what happens to people who move to an urban center or who would leave the rural economic sector, in this case agriculture, and moving to industrial manufacturing jobs. But we actually know a little bit less on what happens to people who live in places that are changing. So places that are urbanizing instead of people who move to urban areas. And the current literature do not really discuss the role of land use transformation on its impact on families, especially families that are locked in agriculture. And this is important. Why? Because we are, at least most of us, are planners. And planners, as someone else mentioned this morning, we have limited fiscal, financial, as well as policy options. Most subnational governments' approach to reap the economic benefit of urbanization is through physical development. And physical development, especially when they are large-scale, corporatized, oftentimes displaces people. And we know little about the magnitude of displacement's economic impact. So to illustrate, in the 1980s, we often imagined urban and rural places as two distinct spaces. Now we know better. But in the past, this was how we perceived cities and villages. There is a lot of literature that talks about voluntary labor flows, people who move from villages to cities to basically get better jobs. And we also understand that this flow actually created another flow, which is basically remittances that goes from cities to villages. But in the 1980s, we also understand that the distinction between cities and villages are actually not that clear. There are shifting borders. and we should see the spaces in between as a continuum, desa kota, if you may. And cities always send not just remittances, but also some capital flowing into villages, and this capital flow actually fuels the rural industrialization, as well as some foreign direct investment as well. And some people actually would prefer to live in, if not villages, maybe in some desa kota continuum, because land is cheaper there, rent is cheaper there. And there are some possible commutation patterns that people actually do between cities and villages and peri-urban areas. What I would really like to talk about today and to highlight is what happens to people who are locked in villages, what happens to people who their livelihood is basically locked in agriculture. They can't really move somewhere else. And there are some forms of displacement that would not allow them to basically continue their livelihood. So first of all, let's talk about rural urbanization, peasant land holdings, and some forms of household livelihood in Indonesia. And what I'm trying to say is that land matters in any of these three relationships. This is from IFLS, Indonesia Family Livelihood Survey. And if I evaluate the effect of both losing land and the effect of living in a place that is urbanizing while you're locked in agriculture, on both income and consumption change, the first column is actually all of the effects of losing land, and the second column is actually evaluating the effect of urbanization. And then first row, we talk about total income, and then farming income, total consumption, food consumption, and then non-food consumption. And in almost all of these scenarios, families that are losing land and are locked in agriculture while the place is urbanizing are actually worse off than the families that are maintaining land, as well as the families who are remaining in agriculture while their place is not changing. The only good news is that total consumption is somehow preserved for some of these families, but that might also indicate changes in prices as well. And if you do some more quantitative evaluation, you would see that total income and farming income is adversely affected by both losing land as well as the urbanization of the place. Second, it's important to just not talk about how land matters, but also how development is actually done. The urbanization rate is not the most important thing. It's actually the spatial pattern of urbanization that is quite interesting to evaluate. And to do that, allow me to use Salatiga, which is a city in central Java, as an example. So if you evaluate land cover changes in periods, you could basically create distinctions between transformations of open grasslands into agriculture or agriculture to urban uses. And if you do more evaluation, you could basically tell whether these changes are clustered or dispersed. And what is interesting is actually the dispersion rate or the clusterization rate of this urbanization actually is a very good predictor of the new incidence of poverty. And this is true for the total number of poor, the total number of very poor, total number of almost poor, and the number of self-reported poor. So if you talk about any of these categories, and if you see places that are changing, this is actually a good predictor for the new incidence of poverty. So what have we learned so far? Of course, it's not a surprise that securing land holding can help maintaining farming households' income and consumption, and that most households that are locked in agriculture could not find alternative income sources to weather an income shock. We didn't see income substitution effect, and what income reduction means to the quality of life when there is no food consumption shock. That means that families that are locked in agriculture would not buy enough clothing for their children. They would stop sending their children to school. They would not buy electricity, or they would buy not enough electricity or clean water, and they would not see the doctor when they are ill. Quantitatively, urbanization-induced displacement cost farmers as much as $100 in annual income. This might not sound much, but these are families who would live on $1 a day. So a shock of $100 in their annual income means losing 1/3 of their income, and that is very significant if you're in a farming household. The second part of the conclusion is that it's the spatial configuration rather than the rapidness of urbanization that is closely related and is very good predictor for the number of new poor people. If we look at more centered, more clustered land use kind of change, especially the changes from agriculture to urban uses, that is actually a better predictor of the newly poor people. So what does that signal? That signals that corporatized real estate, manufacturing industry development kind of type, which is more likely to displace people from rural agricultural livelihood, is a better predictor of new poverty. That means that as much as these kinds of development produces jobs, it actually sends people into new categories of poor and almost poor. People from slightly higher income category are of course less affected, but that's because most likely they have more diverse sources of income and they have their own land. So hopefully this is something that we can think about as part of our quest to having better cities, thinking about not just the good stories, but also when we're assessing policy options, what would be the better options for people who are left behind. I would be very happy to answer questions and comments. Again, thank you very much for having me. Dhanyavad.
From the chair, I can say Dhanyavad again, because you saved 9 minutes. So they'll come back to you. You welcome questions and comments. So you made sure you'll get some. So we move to the final presentation. Partha, you have the floor. The Indian urban transformation, sui generis, subaltern,
Yes.
and sustainable with a question mark. So intriguing. We soon have our answers.
Thank you, Ashwini, and I wouldn't bet too much on having answers. And thank you, I really shouldn't say thank you, because I was almost ordered by Professor Alak to sort of show up here, and so here I am. And you'll have to bear with me for the next 20 minutes. So quickly, that map out there, to follow on very nicely from Ahmed's presentation, essentially is about the density of villages in India, or density of settlements in India. And that, you can see, is the Indo-Gangetic plain, which, if climate change happens, will presumably dry up in about 50 years, right? And that is something I would like you to think about a little bit more, because that's how I think about cities, not necessarily urbanization. But I'll leave it on there for about 30 seconds, just to get a sense of essentially contrast with Mr. Kant's notion of what a good city is supposed to be. That, to me, is sort of a good city. So, okay, leaving that, lunch is close by, so I won't spend too much more time on that. So 1 minute summary for those of you who want to stay away. First, urbanization, as I'll hopefully say, spatially ubiquitous. And it was nice to hear Ahmed's thing about placing, because what I would say is the Indian urbanization story, contrast to the Chinese story, is more about morphing than about moving. Okay. The second is the subaltern thing that Ashwini spoke about, and we will see what we see as we go forward. And it also responds to Wei Ping's story about localizing urbanization in some sense, and where we find what we call urban, right? And finally, sustainability, since Megha's spent a whole presentation on it. I will only spend one slide, but it's busy, and I sort of this is the only slide where I'll sort of engage a little bit with China and things like that and so on and so forth. And I will not talk about resilience and things of that sort because that you already have the 5 eyes to guide you going forward, right? So, ubiquity. This is urban India, right? This is all of urban, and this is the blue ones are the old urban, the yellow ones are the new urban. As you can see, urban settlements are popping up all over the place. And this is in a country where, let me tell you, it's incredibly hard to be urban. Though, just to sort of take a broad historical first thing I would ask you to figure out is India has been treating populations of 5,000 as urban for the last 150 years. Okay? Regardless of what, 5,000 in 1872 was a really big place, but it's still an urban qualification today. And secondly, what I would say is we focus a lot on economic activity, and we really focus a lot on economic activity even way back in 1891, right? We just don't like large villages as urban places. Unless they're doing something other than agriculture, we don't want them to be urban, right? So that's clear. But it's only for the last 60 years or so that we've been running with our current threefold definition of density, economic activity, and size. And if you take that stuff, there's only one country in India that has that definition. Or one country in the world that has that definition, that's us. Hence, sui generis. We are literally, definitionally unique. That kind of threshold that we have here, 75% of non-farm work, is actually the highest bar that you need to carry. So it's pretty hard to be urban in India. But the worst part is, even if you're urban, if you made all this effort and jumped over the hoop and became urban, the census still doesn't want to count you as urban. So last time we did a census, we have forgotten how to do censuses for a long time now. Last one we did was I was still in, I had black hair. It was that long ago, right? So the census sort of didn't count about 23 million people who are living in all kinds of urban places, because the way the census actually counts urban is they count the urban before they do the census. And if you want to know why, I'll tell you what the story is, right? But we'll leave that for the moment. So fundamentally, if we use only size, we would be 47% urban. If you remember the first map I showed you on the title slide, that's density, we'd be 69% urban, more than China. And if you use size and density, which is what most people use, and this economic activity is not so much of an issue, then we would still be about 44% urban, instead of 30 is what they say we are, right? So this begs the question, and here Anand asked the question. This is, Megha's institution. A long time ago, there was a guy who put together something as part of one of the World Development Reports, and they used a different definition from the one. They tried to do a common definition because you see all these different definitions floating around makes life miserable. So you end up saying, we will use a proximity definition. Anything that's sort of between about an hour's travel of a bulk of people of 50,000 things is considered as urban. And if you did that, in 2001, when they did this calculation, the official number for India was 28. We jumped up to 52, right? China was 36, remained at 36. So the question is, but what you do see is if you actually look at the Chinese stuff, the only reason I use China is because they're big enough to be compared with, is this is the big cities. Blue is Indian agglomeration, red is Chinese agglomerations. There's a lot happening in urban that is not big. So what I'll do for the most of my next presentation is basically focus on, oh, that's bad, I messed up. is on the not so big stuff, right? So the first thing that I'll broadly tell you is, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner in bright yellow, you'll see the difference. You'll see first what Wei-Ping told you about, which is migration was the core driver of urbanization in China. And you'll see the morphing story, which is reclassification and natural growth, are the key drivers of urbanization in India. And that's the way the growth of population went in. Roughly about 30 million people moved from rural to urban, and about 10 million people moved back into rural areas from urban areas, a net increase of about 20 million, which was roughly about 22%. But the total growth in urban population was about 90 million, right? And most of that growth, as you see, these are, census towns, which are basically small settlements, where a lot of people start doing non-farm work, and that's where it's different from where Ahmed was speaking about, with lots of villages, rural, but not doing farming. That's the other weird stuff that we do here. Our villages don't farm. So, and we do a lot of that, this is what this show is about. But and if you look here, what you find out is fundamentally that the big cities are not growing. This big bar increase that you see is, if you just take the yellow bit, is if you took the same cities as before and looked at their share of population. And what you find out is they actually fell. It went down from 25.6 to 24.3. The only reason the category went up is because some of these mid-sized cities became big enough to be included in the category. So the growth is here, and the growth is here in these census towns, and in the mid-sized towns. The really small ones are not doing so well either. But this is where, therefore, we need to start focusing on. And this is what we fundamentally will do. So we spent, partly it was just cheekiness, looking around for what to call what our research project, and we found that this sounded like a name. We floated it, the reviewers bought it, and so it stuck. And now we now pushing it down to even push it around as Indian Insights for Urban Theory, let other people play with it, maybe Ahmed will have some fun with it. So the issue is, but fundamentally, there is actually a kernel of truth, because we are focusing on actions that people are taking on their own and largely independently of the elite. And I'll make that a little bit clearer as I go along. But what we are doing here, and this is Ranajit, the guy who's cooked up this whole subaltern studies school, that's his core thrust of going forward. And what we are therefore moving in, the first thing I want to show you is, remember all those exciting growing small towns? The first thing you see is that the economic structure of those towns is not really very different from the bigger ones. And that's not surprising. Why is that not surprising? Because all of Europe doesn't really have million cities. You really look very hard. Bordeaux is like, what, 500,000? Drinking wines from all over the world. It's 500,000 people. A little neighborhood down the road, right? So a lot of these benefits that we economists, I'm not a planner, I'm an economist. So we talk about, which says agglomeration, net productivity, all of that stuff. We really have no idea at what scale that kicks in. It quite possibly can kick in at 300,000, 500,000. Is that big enough? And after that, just like vaping's wonderful urbanization rate, it just all that productivity gains stop and sort of makes no difference whether 500,000 or 5 million. Your productivity remains roughly the same, right? And if that is the case, then economic structures would look roughly similar. Now, of course, it doesn't work always because modern services, and that's sort of, I don't know why this has happened. I thought I sent in a PDF, but whatever it is. If you look at modern services, that's where you see some real movement in the big cities, where the share of their labor is going up. And you sort of recognize that. That's the Hyderabad, Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, and the next wannabe city, which wants Chennai, of course, and the next wannabe city, which wants to be them, right? But for manufacturing, for a lot of the stuff that Ahmed was talking about, it looks like it's just fine to be a 500,000 city, right? And if you move from production to consumption, you'll find that these guys, the consumption pattern isn't very different. And they consume a fair bit. For every 1 rupee that the big city guy spends, the small city guy spends 70 paise. And part of this can also be most probably prices, because these things are not controlled for spatial differences in prices. So it sort of works out relatively well. So that's the small town stuff. And then look at the rural stuff, which is the stuff that Ahmed was talking about. The first thing that you note is that there's a lot of non-farm activity that's happening in rural, right? The darker browns are more than 40% of that district's, and district is a big place, workforce is into non-farm activity. And you can see there's a lot of brown around that place, right? So there's a lot of, these are rural non-farm. These are not district level stuff. These are rural workforces which are doing non-farm work. And way back in 2011, and now after all this wonderful growth that we have had because of this government of the last 10 years, we obviously must be doing much better, right? So you'd expect this map to look way more brown than this map currently does. And the second thing is, once you have taken out the agricultural labor and looked at what is the structure of the rural workforce, which is doing non-farm, you find it's not much different from the urban workforce which does non-farm. And in fact, they do a little bit more manufacturing than the urban guys. And if you went back again, this is around when the time we did our census, when I had black hair, around that time, they also calculated what was the share of GDP that came from rural areas and urban areas, and you don't want to tell this to anybody. The rural share of manufacturing is more than the urban share of manufacturing in GDP. Right? Now you don't want to say that because you know what'll happen, but that is the truth. Okay? And that's why they stopped doing all the calculations after that. They said, we don't want to learn any more about this. So, then what happens? So let's look at figured out, okay, Megha spoke about the guys crowding in from the peripheries into these areas. What this shows you is how the people decided to settle. And again, actions of people, and I'll come to the stuff in a second. If you look at the actions of people, what you see is they aren't doing anything particularly irrational. They are expanding around the edges and going along transport corridors, which is what you would expect them to do, right? So it should be pretty easy to plan for it. Just plan around the edges and plan around the transport corridors. But we don't do that. Don't ask me why. Right? So, same thing, it's just nicer, brighter pictures, 6 night lights, because that's what people use nowadays. Ask Megha, she'll tell you. But you also see that, and this is where the elite, remember we're talking about elites and people and so on and so forth. This is the elite. These are the people. There's almost no investment in infrastructure in these peripheries. right? Except you'll see a little bit of stuff happening here, and you'll see in a second what is happening there. The first, this gives you, by size class of cities, what is the investment in sewerage and water supply. And it's changing. There's a big new program. The officer who's been running it is right here in the audience, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But there is actually a huge program, which is, as all of you know, we're trying to get water to every household, connect everybody, and so on and so forth. So these numbers will obviously change. But way back in 2001, when they actually did these number crunchings, what you found was the big cities were the only ones. All the small cities are almost, this is like the percentage of cities, all these are small cities, this is the big city. Big city, small city. And this is water supply and sewerage, which government or somebody in the public sector has to actually provide, right? This is two-wheelers, which you can buy, and septic tanks, which you can build on your own. And when that happens, you see the small cities are doing just fine as compared to the big ones, right? Because people are investing, are taking their own decisions, taking their own actions, as long as they can do, whatever they can do on their own, they're doing. Whatever they need to depend on the government and everybody else is not getting done, right? So what you then have, but this subordinity and this sort of on your own action comes with a small price, actually a large price. What happens is one part of the urban, which is about changes in social attitudes, and in India there are a lot of attitude. We have stuff around religion, we have stuff around caste, we have stuff around many, many things. 5,000 years of civilization comes with 5,000 years of baggage. And that baggage comes into our cities.
Arthur, you had different...
Yeah. Yes, I'll be done. I was waiting for him to give me a sign up. So there we are. So this is the final slide, which is the sustainability of the impact of the urban. Right? So far, the sui generis, subaltern, people-driven urbanization, where has that got us? And this is one of the reasons why only 14% of the nasty climate stuff comes from low-income countries. And the first thing is, if you look at the right-hand side, that's the Chinese growth in per capita living space. The Indian growth is much, much less. The Chinese went from roughly 70 square feet to about 400 square feet, actually to control for the fact that they don't count the urban population properly, so we fixed that as vaping did, and it goes from about 70 to 300. India's moved from about the same to 120, right? So we use less living space, we use fewer buses and very many fewer cars. We sold 4 million cars instead of 28 million in China, even though a bunch of them were electric. 7 million air conditioners versus 200 million in China. And the last one is exactly what Weiping spoke about, which is the square built up per square kilometer. India too has gone up. This is the number of persons. A built up area, square kilometers per person, going up is bad, which means it's sprawling, but less so than the Chinese moved from 70 to 110, we moved from 20 to 24, right? So fundamentally, so far we haven't burnt up the planet because, as you can see, the Chinese growth has also been driven by that red line that you sort of saw, which is the growth in emissions. And this stuff is the one that's the Indian emissions growth. Right? So just to repeat, so far we haven't burnt up the planet. If the kind of urbanization will go forward, once we move from the people to the top-down stuff, we might change that story. Thank you.
Right. So we have 4 very rich presentations, also very dense, also full of ideas, not all traveling necessarily in the same direction all the time. So there should be a lot of questions. The way it is now is that we have 35 minutes. So we can take one round of questions. When you ask a question, please direct it to one of the speakers. And if it's a general question, then we'll see how it is. No long comments. Please save those for lunch. But if you can make it sharp and incisive, a comment is also fine. But it must be crisp and to the point. I'm sure you can all achieve that. You're well practiced in the art of keeping to time. So I see one hand, that's Santosh. Then I see one here, 2. And I see one of there, 3 and 4. So I'm going to take these 4 in the first round. So please, your name and then to whom it is directed.
My name is Santosh Mehrotra. I was professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University right here in New Delhi. My question is to Professor Wu. 2 questions, ma'am. The first is about something that you mentioned at the beginning of a presentation, fiscal decentralization. And in some ways, I regard that as a huge area of contrast between India and China, because China is a unitary constitution, it is a one-party state, India is a federation, it has a multi-party democracy, but China is more fiscally decentralized than India is. Would you like to dwell on the literature in a sense that has emerged out of looking at why China grew rapidly, and Justin Lin and Liu, I think all that literature which sort of puts fiscal decentralization as a very important reason why China grew as rapidly as it is. Second question, very briefly, is again a contrast between India and China about the structure of the structure of the size distribution of urban population. My understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, about the Chinese distribution of the size structure of Chinese cities is the following, that nearly half of the urban population is located in what could be called mid-sized towns, mid-sized cities of 500,000 to 4 million, assuming that we are thinking of a 4-fold classification of small, below 500,000, medium size, 500,000 to 4, large cities 4 to 10, and then mega cities over 10. While by contrast, half of India's urban population is actually accounted for by the small cities, which seem to be suggested by Partha as well, or maybe not. How do you account for this particular phenomenon, this mid-sized towns accounting for most of the Chinese urban population? Is it largely to be do with sort of hukou and urban planning, or something else? Thank you.
Right. So that was the first one. I think just share. Name, please. Yeah.
My name is Aniket, and I'm a faculty at National Law School. I teach sociology and public policy. And my question is to Megha. Mostly when we were talking about, or when we were discussing about that, how 5 Is are important in terms of assessing the impact of urbanization and also looking at the policies which will lead to an inclusive model of urbanization. But at the same time, are we also deliberating in a direction where we are pointing out that the cities are isolated entities? Because in most cases, as the panel members have also pointed out, that there has been a certain parochialization, there has been a certain way in which Professor Weeping was pointing about in terms of there is a provincialization of the cities in that manner, then are we looking or are we discounting the facts such as state, culture, historicity, and ideology, political economy, when we operate from a lens which looks at cities as isolated entities and aims at devising mechanisms such as 5 Is, which you have pointed out. So this is more of a question to engage with in much deeper sense, to understand that how does we look at policy, and as Professor Partha was talking about, and he has already mentioned, pillars do not make cities, people do. So we have to understand in that context that how do we look at these policies? Are these policies looking at a certain form of a growth, or are they looking at a certain form of a developmental model which has a certain value-laden principle attached to it?
Okay, thank you. That's taking us in a very useful direction, I would say. I think we had a hand right at the back somewhere. Who was it? Have you changed your mind about asking a question? That'd be nice. Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Sonal. I'm the founder of the Urban Catalysts. My question is to Megha. I'm going to pick up on the last I, on investments. And how do you think that this research on climate change is also driving conversations in the bank around what not to invest in?
That's good. I think I'm going to insert, there's something because you brought up this eyes, I think has gone to Megha, so just in the interest of time, I'll attach a small question about other eyes. I'm not looking for hands at this time. There are still people in the queue. I'm just using my prerogative from the chair to speak. You have 5 eyes, but eyes, if you look in the dictionary under eye, you get so many eye words. So
Oh dear, I don't know what's coming up.
I got a few other eyes, Following the spirit of the comment now, inclusive, didn't figure. Inequality, not explicit. And inequality is very crucial in all this. For instance, when we had this thing about tall buildings, which worker is going to have the money to buy one of those fancy flats on what money, et cetera, and so on. But anyhow, innovation, I suppose it's somewhere or the other, but somewhere. Infrastructure, I suppose that's investment, but investment could be many kinds. Ideology, your word. So I said, okay. So there are lots of things here which I think I'd like you to, so from, in the Chinese way, you see the 5 eyes, you can go to the 10 eyes, another chapter, another volume, whatever. But I do want to say something which is to do with the imagination. What is the imagination of the urban sector and of these tall buildings and so on? I mean, how does the bank perspective relate to what we heard in the morning? And it also showed up with one of the slides with these buildings going all the way up, and it's in China, you see them all around in the towns. It takes me back to the early work of Le Corbusier, long before Chandigarh. He's the person, he came under very powerful criticism for having a conception of the worker which was that they should be in pigeonholes. So it had to be multi-high-rise, it had to be a block. All the kind of terms that were used at that time, actually all of a sudden are there here, compact. And he did a diagram, what was the average height of a worker, what's the maximum height, plus 1 standard deviation, et cetera. And so how high should the ceiling be? So literally, what should be the size of the pigeon coop? And he came, so the later things that came up in Chandigarh, I think you see a transformation there, because in Chandigarh you don't have high-rise from Le Corbusier. You have very different, if you take the Netherlands, for example, where I've lived, it's one of the most highly dense population structures, you don't have high-rise. It's a scattered kind of a thing in terms of quality of living, but very heavy investments in public transport, which I think came up again in the morning. So I think that's a question of where's the imagination about the kind of urban structures that we are talking about, quite apart from how they were to be financed and linked to the people who are meant to be living there, which are presumably workers coming from the countryside and all the rest of it, to get into the work. So anyhow, I'll use my prerogative once or twice again, but I'll stop this one just to add to your eyes. Yes, Yot, please.
My name is Mukta, and I work with Partho at the Center for Policy Research. My question is for Ahmed Gamal. Fascinating presentation. I had the opportunity a few years ago to do some work not far from Salatiga in the clusters between Semarang and Salatiga. So my question was, what we found was that a lot of people were actually commuting to the jobs in those industrial clusters, what you would probably term as rural industrialization. So I wanted to ask, in your conception of these new poor and the correlation with these new dense urbanized clusters, what is the role of mobility and household diversification? Why is it that those people locked into agriculture, and why are we not seeing, or are we seeing household diversification in which some members of the family are actually going and working in these industrial clusters while others are continuing to do agriculture, which is what we see a lot of in the migration landscape in India. So I just wanted you to shed some light on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I like Ahmad's idea that rate of urbanization doesn't matter. And in that context, I would like to add the definition of urban also doesn't matter. Definition of urban is for comparison, how the change is taking place. So if India's level of urbanization was 31% in 2011, and many scholars dispute, some say it is 42%, World Bank says 54%, and Partha has also given several level of urbanization. Now, my question is that, does the change in the definition or level of urbanization change some of the realities? And one of the realities is that when we see rural to urban transition, that 45% of India's population workforce is dependent on agriculture and contributing to 14% of the GDP. So this is important for rural urban transition rather than changing the definition. Changing the definition doesn't change this type of dependence on agriculture or agrarian crisis that the India is facing, or there are so many issues that the farmers related policies are there. So this is one question. Second question is that India's definition of urban is dynamic. We have census town this time, 2011, and we have also towns getting declassified. So these definitions, criteria are applied, and then towns which are declared as a census town in 2011 may not remain census town in 2021 or whenever the new census will come. So what happened in 2001? There were about 500 towns have been declassified. In 2011, it was not many, but about 500,000 population has been declassified. So my question is that, to what extent this census town, which epitomizes subaltern urbanization, can be sustainable?
So we have questions here. I would like further rounds, so I'll request the speakers to address the questions, but hopefully there'll be time for another rounds after this. So we have, Megha, you have some questions yourself? The last one, I think maybe it's in your direction, also, very much. And Mukta as well is for Gamal. And I think we have some from Santosh for vaping. Okay, so let's start with, in the same order.
So the first question is the question on who does it. In my presentation, I speak mainly about mayors and cities, but you're absolutely right. When we talk about who gets it done, we talk about all the different actors. It's also about the national governments, the states, the provinces, what you might call it in different countries, about civil society, private sector, and so on. It's just impossible to cover that in a presentation of this sort. The book, there are two parts. There's a very, very fat book, which has all the information, and then there's a thin summary, which kind of provides an overview. So again, it's in the book, and we speak to many of the different ways in which they need to coordinate, cooperate with one another. In many cases, the actions should not be at the level of the city, they should be at a higher level, and in some cases, it should be at the level of neighborhoods, or it should be communities or bottom-up that should be driving the actions. It really depends. The second question on what not to invest in, it's a really good question and one that we grappled with ourselves. There's a reason why the fifth I is the fifth I. We don't start with investments. It's sort of a sequential way of thinking about what you can do. It's not just about what you can do as an institution, but our job is to advise policymakers. What I would count as successful in my job would be if I can make the job of the policymakers far easier. right? So it's basically those policymakers that we're advising so that they can do their jobs well. And our advice is that you don't necessarily need to start with investments. In fact, those are the most expensive part of what you need to do. They're the most durable, if you think about infrastructure, the most durable investments over time. So really, we're saying in the report, you want to start with the options that have the highest benefits or the highest co-benefits but can be cheaper. And so I'll give an example, right, of providing information, just simple information on where you can build or where there should be household. Redfin in the US is a big firm that provides information on folks that are looking to buy houses, on price and so on. It's only been about a year or two that Redfin now has information on natural hazard risk, which was never provided as any kind of information because there was simply no regulation that forced private companies to provide information on the risks related to particular neighborhoods. When that's part of the market and information is provided to households and to firms and even to local governments, they're in a much better position to make these decisions themselves. So, point well taken, it's not just about investments, and there's a reason why investment is at the fifth and the last level of the 5 I's. Ashwini, the question of how many I's, I think we need to, people will forget. I think we wanted to start with 3 I's, and then when we went through an internal peer review process, they said that's not enough I's. So we stopped at 5 I's.
Third I was in the forest.
Yes. On your response on what form of investments this should take, again, I don't speak for the institution. I think it really depends on our clients. During COVID, we did some very interesting research. We looked at FAR, which was mentioned by Amitabh Kant in the opening panel, right, which is flow area ratio. And we found that there are parts in Bombay that have the same, Mumbai, that have the same FAR as parts in New York. But in New York, it's far easier to maintain social distance in COVID because the FAR is a lot higher, right? There's a lot more space that's available. And so, density is the same in parts of Bombay and New York, but the FAR in New York is a lot higher, and that completely changes the way that you can actually live, and in this case, distance with one another if you needed to. So I think there are different parts of urban investments and forms that our own clients sort of, they're the ones who drive this going forward. And I just want to make a point about public transport versus mixed-use investments. Again, for us, it's not only about public transport. If you want to get people closer to their jobs and you want people to get closer to their services, there are 2 ways to do it. You can put them far apart if they want more land, and you can have huge investments in public transportation systems that can move those people back and forth. Or you can have mixed-use development that brings those jobs, public services, and the people themselves closer. As a policymaker, you need to think about what is going to be more efficient and what's going to work culturally in your situation. So not something that we push very strongly, but it really depends on our clients. Thank you.
So on decentralization, it's been quite a tortured process, obviously. Initially, very much motivated by the more well-to-do provinces on the coast. So there was the clear incentives pragmatic incentives to create more efficiency and more returns in certain pockets of more growth engines, say Pearl River Delta, and later on moving further up along the coast. But the decentralization, overall, the policies grind to a halt about 1994 because the central government essentially had so sort of significantly decreased control over revenues that they really became very much of a problem. So actually interprovincial and official transfers have never been a major source of support for provinces and local levels, even for the very underdeveloped regions. You know, China is characterized by significant regional disparity. So in 1994, there was a major tax reform, essentially re-centralized major physical resources, particularly in terms of taxes. And so even though I said that China is very decentralized fiscally, local governments actually have very little control over taxation rates, and all taxation are actually submitted to the center, with the exception of 2 very small taxes. So 1994 essentially was a turning point that local governments began to see disparities between expenditure responsibilities and revenue responsibilities. So there's that huge gap. Then subsequently it's being filled by extra budgetary revenues, and most of which comes from land lease, hence the perverse incentive that I was talking about. So the more you lease out land, and then the more revenues that can fill the shortfall, the shortfall between expenditure and revenue responsibilities. And that ability is much higher for larger cities on the East Coast. And for smaller cities in the more inland areas, their ability to generate their own revenues is much, much smaller. So they rely much more on budgetary revenues and some forms of fiscal transfer. So it is actually a quite tortured process, and there's been a lot of discussion on allowing localities to have possibilities of imposing property taxes and be able to actually have some control over rates of property taxes, but that all grind to a halt around 2015, and then of course pandemic hasn't really helped with that. So that conversation, policy-wise, hasn't gone very far. And on your question about size distribution of cities in terms of population, that's actually a really important question and really relates back to the large scheme national urbanization policies that China has implemented ever since the 1950s with the hukou policy, right, the household registration system. I think what we're looking at is the second, or not second, it's sort of the alternative. Without that policy, we would have seen large cities taking much higher percentage of the urban population in the country. There's always been, even now, not explicitly, control of population growth in the largest cities. And both in terms of investment, there was large degree of disinvestment in the largest cities before 1979, and after 1979, and particularly after migration took off, there's been lots of both local and central level regulations in terms of the kind of urban amenities and benefits that migrants can receive, especially in the very large cities. I think hukou actually doesn't matter that much anymore in smaller cities, and especially third and fourth tier cities, but it matters a great deal in the very large cities. So what you're seeing is it's the second best option for migrants to go to medium-sized cities rather than go to the very large cities. Yes, they actually do want to go to very large cities. In fact, in Beijing and Shanghai, now more than almost 40% population are migrants. However, it's becoming harder and harder to send children to schools, let's say in the very large cities if you're a migrant, so on and so forth. So I think what you are observing is very much what's happening with both policy, market, and regulations of the challenge of going and settle in the largest cities in China.
In the interest of preserving time, I didn't really mention why I use Salatiga as an example. In the 1987, Salatiga annexed two sub-districts of the Regency of Semarang. And why they did so was so that they could basically re-administer lots of community-owned lands into public lands. What that means is that they have readily available lands to be leased into the hands of private developers. So you see the state's vested interest in development and sort of a hidden agenda for state-sponsored displacement as well. Which I guess, listening to Professor Wu is not something that is very unique to Indonesia case, because, there is this vested interest to encourage physical development in any place in the world. So it lends itself to a very ideal kind of quasi-experiment for my study. You were right, there is a lot of commutation patterns, and actually that is what spearheaded my study. Really the question was, are the people who are getting jobs from these newly manufacturing industry developments are the same people who live in those places? They're definitely not. The people who live there are displaced, for many reasons, right? There are different skill sets. There are different requirements. There are the interest of city people who move in with investments, who wants a certain set of people who work for them, and so on and so forth. Really, what my study was trying to do is not giving a new definition, giving a better definition of who is poor and who is not. I just took that from the Census Bureau. But really what we're basically trying to do is to provide a better accounting of who benefits, who is displaced, and who gets the adverse impacts of development. A lot of the motivation for my study is driven by the frustration that lots of studies doing the impact of development on livelihood is non-spatial. And because they're non-spatial, they don't really do good people accounting. I think we should just do employment accounting. I think we should do sort of more complicated, more complex people accounting, where people actually resides, where people actually works at, and the churning, right? The most important part is the churning. Who gets what, when, and through what events. Thank you.
I think in this, the thing which I'm missing actually in all our discussion on the whole is not between small urban and big urban and so on, but really people who don't migrate, agriculture, people who are still left behind in the countryside, and those who are the migrants. The migrants themselves are not necessarily doing wonderfully well, though migration is a lifeline very often. But lifeline is also something, people who are actually, whose lifeline has been taken away. So there's distress migration. And so I think the patterns that you get of people coming into various categories of urban have a reflection of what these flows are, where they're emanating from. And I think that defines in many ways policy issues which are quite critical, which I didn't hear earlier on, and I'm sure they're going to come up in the course of these 3 days. Like, for instance, where are the jobs going to come from? If they're moving, what percentage of the population is moving? We heard about manufacturing, but manufacturing as a ratio of GDP is single figures. And so if you're thinking of high rise and so on and so forth, single figures, and I think that's not going to absorb, and its absorptive capacity of labor is even less. We know that. I mean, the employment elasticity of proper manufacturing is very, very low. And so if you take that into account, then where's the absorption of labor going to come from? So I think there are these issues of imbalances which are left out. Then there's another thing which comes up, is inequality. If you don't want cars, if you want public transport, are the poor not to be allowed to buy cars? The poor who will not be poor soon, hopefully, as they go up the scale. And I think that there's going to be a huge demand for consumer goods. And that's the argument that the Global South has in relation to the Global North, that you had a good time, it's our turn now, and you're putting on the brakes. And if you take that argument and take it into the country itself, it's the same argument, poorer people saying, hey, hang on a bit, you've got your 2 cars and 4 cars and your high-rise and your farmhouses. Now it comes to our turn, you say, we give you public transportation. So I think there is a question there. But if you take those brakes off, and people can consume, and I think it's a democracy and they will consume because it's a consumer-driven economy, consumption-driven economy, then in that case, you're actually violating a lot of the assumptions which are coming up. So I think there are some issues which I'd like to sit in, and I'm sure they are showing up now in the next 2-3 days, because there's such a big, rich pattern of development. So I think what it comes back to you as a smaller addition to the thing, Partho, is that maybe a word or two about a contrast between the rural and the urban, however it is defined in this way.
Let me begin by responding first to Professor Bhagat, of course, who's a technology expert in this field. But let me also then take the opportunity to advertise my colleagues' both work and session tomorrow at 2 p.m. You'll have to figure out where the location is. I think Rohit Negi's session, Shamindra Roy, my colleague, will be speaking, or Kanu Pradhan. And their work, seminal work on census towns ever since they started. Fundamentally, what they find is census towns which are not connected to anything. by which I mean they are not close to any, even a class 2 town, even a town of 50,000 that I put together. They're not in between towns. They're not peripheral to towns. So completely on their own, so to speak. They account for roughly about a quarter of the workforce structures there, right, often within the census town stories. So even within the sort of the sustainability of the census town story, there seems to be a fair amount of mass demand locally that can sustain even isolated structures, but obviously which are much more connected, linked to broader markets, etc. So the peripheral, the interstitial, those kinds of proximate stuff are about 3 out of 4 of the census town workers, right? So there is, they are more sustainable. These are perhaps less sustainable, but they still sort of most probably cross a threshold. That's the way I would put it. Now, to take your story on Ashwini, I think one of the things that would be interesting to look at, I mean, Mukta has been doing a lot of work on migration, but the core thing that we find is old-fashioned Harris Todaro, right? You are moving to the urban area. It's not, your expected wage is higher, but it's not as if your actual wage is higher. And what happens in the bigger and broader cities, and it's partly what Wei-Ping was talking about, is the restriction in China of holding back people by giving them hukou only for mid-sized cities. Nothing like that in India. So you have a circular go in, try, and then you move back again. But what we do see is once you've controlled for prices, broadly speaking, casual workers in rural areas make more real income than casual workers in urban areas, right? But in the urban areas, you also have the probability of moving into regular work, which you don't have in rural areas. And that wage premium makes it worthwhile for people to take the chance and move in. And people are taking that chance and moving in. One of the things that public transport does, and relatively cheap public transport, that's train, roads, buses, etc., is allows you to buy these lottery tickets from time to time by moving in and out of these structures. And the same kind of circularity, I think, that Ahmed was also speaking about. And therefore, one of the other discourses that I think needs to change is the story about migration being some kind of event rather than actually a process or an instrument or just another bundle of options or actions that people have at different points in time to take some of these structures in place, right? The reason I'm a little hopeful is also because you do see that even in rural areas, you are seeing people coming in with higher human capital and better ability to move, something that China did a long, long time ago. And that sort of makes the possibility of the kind of accessing those regular jobs slightly better. So it's not all doom and gloom yet.
Well, that's it's very nice to have a positive note to go out when you're going out for lunch. I think it'd be terrible if I then came and started talking about productivity differences and this, that, and the other. I think that would be you wouldn't be able to enjoy your dessert. So I think I should. I'd said we'd give the floor again to everybody for a last minute thing. But if there's something really urgent, which you can say in 30 seconds. That is, I'm following Alex's rule. He said somewhere 30 seconds. No, we're not going to outside. So if you can say something in 30 seconds, you're most welcome. I think Partha has ruled out because he's just been the speaker at this moment in time. Apart from saying thank you.
Yeah. I think somebody wants 30 seconds from the floor, I think.
30 seconds, ma'am.
Okay. This is for Professor Wu. Now, this Chinese story of urbanization after 1976 is also a story of transformation of the land market, starting from a totally socialist good to a market-driven good. Now, combining that with what Partho said, and you also showed that the urban land also increased. I just want to know whether this is a result of purchasing power going up and buying more land, or it is a conscious decision of urban planning or something so that more and more land is available for urban use. Thank you.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah. Actually, really quickly though, the answer is it hasn't really privatized land, and the state actually has control over land, at least in name. And the land leasing mechanism, in the context of fiscal decentralization, provides that perverse incentive to continue to lease out land and develop and sprawl. That's the short answer. And then I just want to respond to Professor Sass's question about who gets the job, where's the job come from really quickly. I have very little observation of India, but it strikes me that manufacturing sector is much, much, much smaller than China. And the migrants were primarily absorbed and worked in manufacturing sector. So there's a huge challenge, I feel.
Yeah, I think so. And in terms of land, I mean, looking back into the collective era, there was always a the amount of agricultural land was going down year on year by little amount, but here it's much more, and the process, the mechanism behind it is different. Okay, but...
There you go.
Any more?
30 seconds.
30 seconds?
No, nothing, just a thank you on my end. Thank you. Nothing to add.
Are you doing another volume with the other 5 eyes? Martin, you want to come back or anything?
Enjoy life.
Yeah, you're good? Okay, I think we've had a very rich fare, which is soon to be expressed also in the richness of the food. Let me leave a question with you for the subsequent sessions. It's to do with that big I, the imagination. And I think it's to do with what I think it's come up, the urban, what's the urban experience? What's urban, the form? And I think that's most important. I said something nasty about the early Corbusier, and I think that was well deserved for him. But let me also say that if you look around many European cities, high-rise is actually the problem area. And high-rise is risky. It's, things about fire hazard. There are all kinds of internal, it's a ghettoization because the social exclusion doesn't go away. And that exclusion means that if you have high-rise of this kind, this is what happens. So there are lots of issues around this and what really constitutes an urban form which is possible and nice. So I think that I'm just leaving that as a question, that the urban form, which I think Amitabh Kant in the morning highlighted, is the most important question. And I think he threw the ball so that there is something to be discussed about what are, and it doesn't have a unique form everywhere. It was Mr. Ambani's company which actually wanted to talk about the verticality and to replace Dharavi with vertical spires. Thank you.